Hello and welcome to the Intentional Clinician podcast. I'm your host, Paul Krauss, licensed professional counselor. I believe you are just going to love today's interview. I'm interviewing Tom Beakbane. He is the author of a recent book that was published called How to Understand Everything, Consilience, a New Way to See the World. I know that sounds like a lot, but once you hear from Tom Beakbane and see why he wrote the book and how he wrote the book, I think you will be very intrigued, whether you were into psychology and philosophy or whether you were just interested in the world and human nature. A little bit about Tom. Tom Beakbane is the president of Beakbane, Brand Strategies and Communications, a company he launched in 1986 to capitalize on digital technologies. Tom and his team have delivered over 20,000 projects to Fortune 500 customers in a wide variety of industries, including pharmaceuticals, sexual health, nutrition, education, grocery, industrial, and high-tech products. His journey to resurrect the concept of consilience began when he tried to understand why textbook explanations of human behavior did not account for the techniques routinely utilized by marketing, communications, and political operatives. Also, he observed that psychology textbooks did not fully explain the interpersonal dynamics he had observed while providing services to his company's clients. He realized that by weaving together developments on the frontiers of biology, physics, and computing, and re-conceptualizing human behavior as an emergent system, it was possible to explain the nature of understanding in ways that are all-embracing. He has an honors degree in biochemistry and neurophysiology from Durham University in England. He lives near Toronto, Canada with his wife, and they have 2 daughters. So stay tuned for the interview. I think you are going to love it. As you may have heard, I've released my first online course for the parents of young adults, What Should We Do Now? And it's a course that goes over parenting young adults and all of the difficulties right now with the world we find ourselves in, and how do you navigate the mental health system, and what do you do if they have an addiction, and what about boundaries and communication and all the difficulties you might run into, what about money? The course covers it all. It's almost 3 hours of video and has some worksheets along with it. You can find it on sale right now at udemy.com, and I will have the link in the show notes. If you are a therapist who is trying to bring their practice to the next level, then I would suggest getting trained in EMDR therapy. This is a trauma-informed therapy that does amazing things. There are hundreds of studies on it. You can read all about it. And the people that I trust to train you are all veteran trainers that have been training people for years and years and now have started their own operation, EMDR Training Solutions. That's right, I have an affiliation with them, and they have helped me out a great deal. If you use the code INTENTIONAL, you can get $100 off your EMDR training. I will have the link in the show notes. All right, now let's get to the interview. Welcome, Tom Beakbane, to the Intentional Clinician podcast. I really appreciate you coming on.
Great to be here, Paul.
Excellent. So I'm excited to tell everyone about your book, which had an interesting title, and I've been enjoying it, and I'm excited to have you introduce us to some of the concepts. How to Understand Everything, Consilience, a New Way to See the World. And I have to confess, before reading parts of your book, I had never actually heard of the word consilience. And I think probably we might have to define it slightly at the beginning here, just so people know what we're kind of referring to. You actually have a whole YouTube video that explains it in about 3 or 4 minutes, but what would you kind of sum it up as?
Yeah, well, the word was coined by a fellow called William Whewell in 1840 in the UK, and he was a cleric and a polymath, and he used it to mean the jumping together of different ideas. So Consiliens in Latin means jump, and com means together. So consilience is the jumping together of 2 areas of knowledge that would otherwise be disconnected. And I use it in the sense that I believe that now the sciences have become so interwoven that we can now reasonably claim to understand how the brain works. Even though that's not a mainstream view in neurophysiology, I just say, well, just get rid of all your preconceived ideas about how you think the brain works and just look at how neurons work, how the eyes work, how the ears work, how muscles work, and you've got to jettison many of the ideas we have about, for instance, the word brain and how it's an organ set apart in the human body. So for me, consilience is it's a new way to understand understanding, and in the process, it's a way of completely reframing how we understand the world, because the human brain does some remarkable things that we don't fully realize. But the way the world works, it isn't like we think it works, and so it's a huge idea, and I'm looking forward to getting into some of the nitty-gritty with you.
It is quite a large idea because I know you talk a lot about paradigm shift in the book, but it really is a paradigm shift. And it reminds me, I'll just kind of, for the listeners from the psychology world, it reminds me of how I first became educated in trauma-informed therapy, which I've actually started thinking should be called nervous system-informed therapy, because not everyone identifies with having a trauma, but the way that an event can have an effect on your nervous system and be stored somewhere in the body that you're unconscious of, and then all of a sudden in your behavior, against maybe what you would call your willpower or your decision making, something happens, and then eventually you learn, oh, that's why I'm doing that behavior. It's because this happened to me, but I didn't predetermine that I should do that. So, the idea of trauma informed therapy is still a paradigm shift in the counseling world. There's the counselors that aren't trauma informed and are frustrated by clients who have certain behaviors or certain intrusive thoughts or obsessions, and they don't know how to help them, right? And they get very upset because they keep coming back, and they may not. The coping skills only work short term. So we've learned that right now that's upended my entire field. And what I'm hearing from you is you're actually taking from that same scientific pot, so to speak, of this new neurobiology that's been coming out in the last 20, 30 years right now, maybe even before then, about how the nervous system actually works, what is the brain, and then Consilience is bridging, how do we understand this information? This is how I see it. How do we understand this information about the brain and the nervous system and how we actually think and how we go about in the world? And how does that then have an effect on all of these different areas in culture, business, marketing, psychology, teaching, education, politics? How does that then coalesce? Because in those disciplines, we still have a lot of archaic thoughts and archaic traditions, almost mythical folklore, if you actually look at the science. Yes. In all of those, including psychotherapy. So I was astounded kind of how you took what, let's say for our listeners, Dr. Dan Siegel is talking about, and translated it into the business world and into marketing and into all these other interactions, which is why I love this book so far. I love it a lot. And
Can I just interrupt and say,
yes,
yeah,
go for it.
You've summarized it very well. I actually go way beyond what you're talking about, because I get into what words are in our brain and how we form words and how we understand everything around us and how we build up this sense of reality. And so for me, it really goes beyond anything that you've met in psychology or in science, and it actually, in some really fundamental ways, I'm pointing out the shortcomings of thinking about things as aspects of knowledge, and when it comes to the human body, brain, neuronal systems, I think historically scientists have been thinking about those things mechanistically, as though there was someone who had a drawing board and designed them much like a mechanical or electrical system, with the brain there sort of directing what's happening in the body, and the muscles acting like pneumatic devices, and the eyes operating like video cameras. And my whole point is that's not how the body actually comes to be. It comes to be from the cells up. You get a sperm and an egg and a zygote, and then it splits and splits and splits again around 40 times until you get the 20 or 30 trillion cells that make up our body. But those cells organize themselves. And so when you're talking about something like trauma, and honestly, I know very little about trauma, but it's far more instructive to think about it from a cellular level, because our bodies don't operate like they were described in the textbooks 30, 50, 100 years ago, with this sort of conscious being presiding over everything, and then a little beneath the surface, a subconscious that is somehow repressed or down there. It's just those historical ways of understanding what's happening in our bodies isn't actually how it works. And so I go way beyond what you refer to.
Yes, you do, absolutely. I think there was a little intersection in my field with what you're talking about. But yes, it actually makes you completely reconsider what's happening in your own body. And you went through, how cells form, and then we move before we think. I really love that chapter, because that's something that is from the psychology we're learning now, which is that the nervous system and the body and everything going on, the body reacts before you're able to make a story about it, before you're able to make logical sense of it, before you even know that you're having an emotional response. Your body has already reacted. And then, because of maybe these old viewpoints of what we call the top-down viewpoint, where the brain's all in control. Well, the brain's actually all throughout your body. And there's more nerve endings in the gut, I believe, than almost any other place. Is that correct?
I'm not sure about nerve endings, but there are innumerable numbers of nerves in the gut and throughout the body, and they don't always go to the brain. That sometimes they stretch just a cell or two away. It's a massively complex and far less neat design than you encounter in anatomical textbooks.
Yes, and so with that in mind, it did take a little bit of reading to even connect that from what I was taught in some of the new stuff that's coming in psychology, that this is just way more complex than we could have ever imagined. And we're still figuring out, and there's so much we don't know. But if we know that, it's coming from this bottom-up self-organizing system approach, and that's kind of how our body and nervous system work, how can we, just out of curiosity, what are some ways that you see that changing how certain viewpoints or systems work in our world right now?
I see Consilience as hopefully the start of a completely new way of conceptualizing human behavior and interpersonal relationships and education and politics. I believe Consilience has massive ramifications. I want to just make the point, if I could, that I don't regard Consilience as, and what I write about as, if you like, Tom Beakbane's crazy ideas. What I do, because I've always been just deeply fascinated by science, and in my business, which is marketing, I've worked with many different companies, some of them pharmaceutical, some of them educational, some of them packaged goods. I mean, hundreds of companies. So I've learned a lot through that whole process. And what my book does really just describes what frontline scientists have been discovering. And I've just tried to do it in the clearest, most accessible way that I can. And in the process, it just becomes very apparent that scientists have been discovering completely upends our mythologies that we tell ourselves about how special human beings are and how our behavior is a result of conscious, rational deliberation, and that honestly, that education somehow fundamentally changes us because our brains are powered by knowledge. Those are mythologies, and when you look at what scientists are actually discovering, and I've played no part in that at all, you just have to completely reconceptualize everything. So it's not Tom Beakbane's crazy ideas. It's just take a look at what's happening, and that's why I believe that this movement that I term Consilience is unstoppable, because at some point people are going to realize that the ways we think aren't the way we actually think and behave.
I like that. I think that is getting at some of this, which is ever evolving, because you started studying this a long time ago. What I mean by this is scientific papers about behavior, the brain, evolutionary biology, neurobiology, neurology, and you had a hunger for this because things just weren't making sense to you. And so, yes, that is a good point. About the book, what you said, one of the things I really admired was the ability to translate what you're reading in these scientific texts to a way that was understandable, with examples, and in a way that your average reader could pick it up, I believe, to a point. So that being said, let's just jump into a little bit about your background.
Sure.
Just about how you got excited about this knowledge, this hunger for knowledge, and how that must have been interesting while you're in university or right after in your first career in business, and everyone's talking one way, and you're reading scientific papers that are showing something differently about human behavior. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I guess the whole thing started just because I've always been deeply fascinated by science and the natural world, and I spent some time as a youngster growing up in Africa. I love being outdoors and in nature, and then I studied neurophysiology and biochemistry at university. But I went into business just because that's what my family's done for the last 500 years, 400 years. I've always not only my scientific interests with what I observe in the business world that I've done through my life, sporting things, skiing and canoeing, and raising a family, and I've been extremely fortunate. But I've always found that these different areas are somewhat disconnected. So playing tennis is disconnected from what is happening in a business meeting, and that's disconnected from what neurophysiologists have been discovering. And so it was about 22, 23 years ago that I wanted to write a short handbook for the staff in my agency, particularly incoming students, to help them figure out what was quality when they're formulating marketing communications. And I was wanting to use some of the techniques that were being used in manufacturing industry. You might have heard some of these terms, Kaizen and Six Sigma and so on. And they all depend on knowing what quality is. And I realized that the accounts in marketing textbooks were completely divorced from the skills that my staff needed in order to do all of the things that we needed to do as an agency. And back then I had a staff of 40 or 50 people. We were quite successful because we were one of the first digital type agencies anywhere in the world. And so that's when I became deeply perplexed and frustrated with all of the the discontinuities in my life. Like why were all of these different realms completely divorced one from another? And so that's when I spent 3 years in science laboratories trying to find myself, like trying to do some self-therapy, I guess you could call it. And eventually I wrote this book, but the earlier version of the book, which was like 20 years ago. And it was a horrible book because it just took aim at all of the current psychological theories, behaviorism, like top-down ways of looking at the world, and it was completely unreadable. So I forgot about the book, doing all of the things that I love to do, and it was only at the beginning of the lockdown that I realized that the accounts that one was reading in the press about politics, Trump and whomever else, and vaccines and the different ways of understanding what was going on were just really short of the mark. And so once again, as a form of therapy, I started writing How to Understand Everything in order to explain to my audience that there are deeper ways of understanding this sometimes crazy situation that we are observing around the world. That's a long way of answering a very quick question.
Well, it's actually, I believe context is very important. And so I think that, understanding, you're getting your ideas from the science, and then the Consilience is trying to bring it in so that that understanding sinks in and helps us with what's going on and how to figure out our lives, but also how to figure out what's going on in multiple ways. So I think it's a very useful book, and I think it's good that you're getting the message out there. Because
can I just interrupt again and just make a point, because I'm not sure where you're going to go, so we might lose this opportunity if you don't mind. So one of I'm sure your experiences with life is that like when you're encountering people earlier at your motel or at university or at church or you're at some scientific conference, those different realms, spirituality and science and therapy and psychology and raising children and doing all of the things you do, they don't seem to have a lot of many things in common. Science is completely different from religion, and we put those two things in different boxes. Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company, is completely different from Lindt chocolate, Lindt and Sprungly, for instance. They're completely different organizations. Well, the way I look at it is all of these organizations have very, very similar dynamics. The dynamics that you encounter in a science department aren't a whole lot different from the dynamics that you encounter in church groups or in any business. And I go even further than that and say, well, actually, the dynamics that we see exhibited from minute to minute really aren't that different one from another. And then I go beyond that and say, well, when you actually look inside our head and at a neuron, that neuron, to the historic scientific way of thinking about it, is firing all the time for everything. Now it changes its tune, and I use the metaphor of a neuronal orchestra. But the stuff that's happening in our brain is handling all of those different domains in an identical manner. And so once you understand the facts about our neuronal systems, all of the divisions between Republican and Democrat and science and religion and children and adults, they all almost disappear. I think you could say. Does that make any sense, Paul?
Yes, it does. I'm getting, having been in a lot of realms, I'm a person who's had 18 different jobs and traveled around the world and all around the US. I have noticed similarities in terms of the dynamics, what you're talking about. In fact, not that this is related exactly to what you're talking about, but just from my standpoint, we would joke about how in a therapy office or in a medical office or in any office, especially an office maybe where people aren't doing a lot of introspection, it all of a sudden, the staff acts as if they're in a family system, back almost as if they're in their own family system and all having these sort of reactions. And I have friends that are scientists who tell me about the grant writing process and people, trying to get their article published, maybe not because it's the best science, but because they really want their name out there. And these sort of things that occur that are just very human in nature are across. And of course, we get all sorts of, I've heard all sorts of reports. We could go on and on about hearing different reports about churches and how things operate there. So in a way, just anecdotally from the surface level, from me observing, and I'm a person who was lucky enough never, I know this sounds terrible because some people would say, I would like stability, but I've never been, I changed schools 7 times as a child. I moved to different places. So I'm used to going, oh, okay, well, this is very similar here. It's just a different cultural layer, right? So that's just a personal observation. So that being said, I can see what you're talking about.
That's right on the money. Mm-hmm.
So, but then you're saying that even knowing what you do about science and how things self-organize and how things, go dynamically, from the, when I mean science, I'm sorry, the research articles you're reading, because we have to define science. So you talked about that in your book as well. Can't just say science, right?
Good point.
The science, the articles you're reading about neurobiology, how the brain works, the neurons and all of that, it's hard to explain until you've sort of seen it. But I do think your book does a good job at illustrating that a lot of things people are doing are on automatic. And we don't often realize that. And I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're trying to say, but that's what I was kind of interpreting.
Yeah, well, that's one aspect. I mean, there's so many different ways, and there's so many sort of cross connections between your past, my past, what I'm reading in scientific journals, how to express those things, the words we use, the different tribes that are involved in all of these different things. One of the stunning, well, there are a couple of really surprising discoveries, if you like, in neurophysiology and cellular biology. And I mean, where it gets interesting is where all of these things start to overlap. But a couple of the points that I explain in my book is that we tend to imagine that the brain is some sort of a computational device, and so our behavior is the result of computation. So is the result of thinking. What we now know, I would say, is that the brain is operating from moment to moment. It's not like our brain is the result of thinking. Our brain is operating always on the knife edge of criticality. So I was just driving along the road. I guess last night I was driving to play tennis, and I was feeling pretty relaxed. I was actually listening to your podcast, and I went round a corner, and for just a fraction of a second, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a car coming at me, and I completely freaked, and it happened in probably less than a third of a second. and then I looked again, and there was absolutely nothing there. I'm not sure what had caught my eye, but what I'm trying to say is, at every second, our whole neuronal system is on the knife edge of criticality. So if something happens that's surprising or threatening, system works. And indeed, when, let's say, you and I are interacting right now, we are sensitive from second to second what each other is doing and saying. And so I can see, because I can see you on Zoom, I can see you're looking pretty chill. If we were sitting in the same room, I wouldn't feel threatened by you. But that could change in a second, and that's a realization about how the brain works that you don't read too much about, and that whole idea that our conscious brain isn't actually controlling our behavior. Our conscious brain is extraordinarily sensitive to social cues, and if someone is insulting or leaves us out of something or threatens us, that can tip our whole neuronal system into panic mode. But that's your area of expertise, not mine. And I'm sure we'll get into this whole thing of tribes, because it relates to this as well.
Yes, but before we get into tribes, Tom, I really was thinking about the intersection of what I've been studying for years, which is trauma on the nervous system in the body, and how that affects the mind and moods, and can lead to mood disorders and things like that, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So when you were talking about having a nice drive to tennis, and then all of a sudden you thought you saw a car, you did see a car, and at that moment, on the cutting edge of, I guess, consciousness, or whatever you want to call that exactly, your whole body, affect, mind change. So can you describe for a second, how did your body feel when you all of a sudden thought there might be a car coming at you?
Well, I've read all about the startle response, so I can sort of rationalize it. But my eyes widen. I sort of brace for impact. I have a sharp intake of breath, and all of those things are happening way quicker than my sort of conscious brain can think, because my thinking is so slow. It takes like half a second or so. So it happened extraordinarily quickly, and you sort of feel your heart speed up, but at the same time, within half a second of that, I looked and I realized there wasn't an issue. So then I sort of just go on my sweet and merry way.
Yes, and so how everything can change in a second, and a lot of what we've learned about trauma and how that can be the roots of a lot of long-term mental illnesses is that in a second, somebody's entire perception of their safety, the way the world works, if it's fair, unfair, just, unjust, all these sort of black and white concepts, or their self-value can change in a moment, not only from something happening to you, but the perception that something happened to you, or the way you perceive the thing that did happen to you. And so that's why our field is actually right now in a giant debate about what post-traumatic stress disorder is, and how you have to get qualified for it, and how actually things that would, many people on the outside would judge as possibly, well, that's just something that happens to you. Somebody else, that actually happens to them. The same thing happens to them. And for them, it all of a sudden sets off a series of possibly fight, flight, freeze, fawn, collapse responses that are instantaneous. And then the person's mind, which happens later, or the narrative part of whatever we do with our stories, it makes up a story to go with this situation. And oftentimes the way that story is encoded in our memory banks, maybe somewhere around the hippocampus, then that affects how that person lives, how they believe the world works, how they believe their self-value is, do they believe they have safety? And all of these things not only have an effect on how they go about and behave, but it also has an effect on their body, the way that maybe they have tension, can they sleep, well, they have trouble sleeping. Do they eat a lot? Do they not eat a lot? Which then translates to what we would call possible mental illnesses, or being on the spectrum of low depression to severe depression, or low anxiety to high anxiety. And so we're seeing how events such as the one you encountered, of course, you were fine, and you all of a sudden your mind may have made up the story that, oh, I guess I just saw something. It wasn't that big of a deal, and now I'm going to start calming down. The startle response is going to start to go away, and I'm back into the normal state you might have been in at that time, or homeostasis. So with that, what we've been learning about in therapy, and this comes from Dr. Peter Levine's work, Waking the Tiger, was he was observing animals. And so after, like, let's say a gazelle was being chased by a tiger or a leopard in Africa, and it didn't get caught, but it almost got caught. And what did this gazelle do? I mean, instantly, I'm sure the gazelle wasn't thinking, oh, what a nice bit of grass over there. It was, oh my, I'm about to be eaten. So it'd run away, and it would lose the tiger, and then it would shake. It would energetically shake, right? And if you've ever had a dog, you can see that if a dog gets frightened, not all dogs, but a lot of dog breeds will then shake. They'll shake their body. And what they're doing, and this is the theory, this is a very dumbed down summary of the theory, is that the animal is shaking off that nervous energy that came from the startle response and the fight, flight, freeze kind of automatic nervous system response, so that they can go back to homeostasis. But humans, often when something happens to us, because of various cultural, social reasons, for who knows why, and people's personalities, some people, quote unquote, shake it off, right? Or they're able to kind of tell themselves a story and say, okay, I'm okay now, or whatever, reorient, homeostasis starts. But others, they care, that nervous system, whatever happened to them, sort of stays they believe, kind of the autonomic nervous system, and not the stays, but the signal of it stays. And we call that, in the theory, is we want to tap into the adaptive information processing network, because your brain is saying, don't die. We have the negative bias. We remember negative things much more clearly than we were.
Yeah, it's a sensible approach.
Right. So we don't want to die. And so that, if this car was about to hit me, and let's say I was almost in an accident in Arizona years ago at this one intersection, and I still remember it plain as day. This person ran a red light, and I screeched to a halt. And every time I went past that intersection again, I would always look and become more alert, and I become more hypervigilant. And why would I do that? My mind is remembering that signal. And so when somebody has a trauma, or let's just say a bad experience, sometimes because they don't know what that was, and it was such a strong experience, and they haven't learned about some of the things you even talk about in your book about how the nervous system works and how these things store, their story builds and builds and builds and builds in a negative way that is usually either self-destructive or non-adaptive to the world around them, or they have a behavior that sort of tries to overcompensate for the fear or whatever happened to them. So that's a big intersection in the world, and that is upending the way that people see psychology, because even in right now my field, there's some people that still believe what happened in the 1950s and even the 1920s about how your mind rules everything, coming from the top down, and if you just had more logic, you wouldn't be so depressed.
Yeah, well, that's all rubbish.
It is. It's complete bullshit, but it's still being done, and it's unfortunate. Some graduate schools are still even teaching this stuff as if the frontal lobe is always online and the neocortex is always online. It's not always online. It goes offline immediately if there's a threat, perceived or actual. So I love that your book is bringing this in a paradigm that's even outside of psychology for people that are interested in this, in what the science is actually saying, because it actually changes the way you think about yourself as a human. And it's changed the way I've thought about myself. And in fact, I actually think it's less judgmental, because you can say, oh, well, that's why I reacted that way in that moment of panic, or that moment of anger, or that moment of whatever. And you can kind of forgive yourself, because you technically may not have actually had the choice you thought you had. Your body's trying to stay alive. It's reacting to a threat. It's gonna jump to that. So
I'll give you a little example of something I encountered at university, which is a long time ago now. But the head of the zoology department in neurophysiology was a fellow called Professor Barker. And his pet enthusiasm with things called muscle spindles. And so I spend a lot of time looking down microscopes at samples of cat muscle, counting spindles and classifying them. Now, not that many people know what a muscle spindle is. In essence, what they're doing is they're telling the brain what the body wants to do next. So this whole idea that the brain is sort of like lording it over the muscles is really only a tenth of the story, because a lot of this happens in the cerebellum. A lot of what happens is like repeated tiny little actions. The way you move your foot or your muscles in a part of your body, but those movements are coming partly as a result of the muscle telling the brain what's going to be the least stressful thing to do next. So, which is, it's an interesting way of looking at it, and it's completely scientific, but it's not part of the mythology of academia. And here I'm going to betray my biases and my pettiness. I'm probably have very different perspectives than many of the people that write books about psychology and neurophysiology and animal behavior, because they're operating in an academic environment with all of the attendant pressures and perspectives that they're submerged in. Whereas I'm a business person, so I'm not trying to keep any academic colleagues happy, and so consequently, I've come to view the human brain and the human body and our neuronal systems in a completely different manner. And now I would claim that the way I'm looking at it is actually far more scientific than the academic perspectives. But once you sort of learn about Skinner and behaviorism and some of the traditional ways of thinking about the brain, or even Jung, it's very hard to shake those things and just understand what's happening at a very basic level. So that's me just completely agreeing with what you're saying, and you're coming at it because of your experiences with trauma, which I know very little about, but we end up at the same place.
Yes. Well, I don't think you'd have any trouble learning about trauma-informed therapies and anything about it, because everything you're talking about in here, the reason trauma-informed therapy became what it is from people, usually a lot of them were at UCLA and other places that are publishing these papers. They took the information, they translated what's actually going on in the nervous system and the brain to the point that we need to know, meaning the psychology people, not you went further, way beyond that. And then how does that actually affect behavior, the way we see it? And so instead of, I guess the difference is this, I believe, and I know this to be a fact, psychology was just made up. We just made it up. I mean, Freud made it up. Jung made it up. It was all theories. It has nothing, but they were doctors. They were real doctors, but they were doctors in the late 1800s. They were Victorian area doctors. Yeah. And then we've taken it from there in the 50s and 60s. Those were still theories, but they were based on practice. Like, okay, we see this working. Do more of that. We see more, do this, do more of this. And then the 70s and 80s to now the point where most therapists are eclectic, because we see, okay, this works, this works, this works. We're not exactly sure why yet. We're still doing studies. We know this works in the room. And so then what trauma-informed or neuroscience-informed therapy has been doing is saying, okay, well, forget about all these theories. How does this stuff actually work? How does then that affect our clients? And how could that affect their narrative, their story, their illness, their strengths? How could we do that? And so for me, I found it like the most true paradigm, because I could apply that paradigm to any sort of technique I'd learned in the past. And all those old techniques were based on complete theories of just grasping in the dark because this has only been studied since the 1800s. You should go back and read some of those old textbooks from the early 20th century. They're horrendously insane and demeaning towards people. Oh my God. And so, even just DSM-3 in 1980 said all sorts of abysmal, terrible things about people. I mean, it's not really that helpful. So what we're finding now is, that's my bias, is that the trauma-informed stuff sticks to what the scientific papers are saying, and then how do we translate that into practice? And what I'm seeing from your book is you go beyond that and you go to, okay, well, this is how things are working, and then how does that what does that mean for human culture? What does that mean for business? What does that mean for tribalism, social justice, power? So I want to move a little bit into some of the larger macro subjects of
Let's do it.
Of how you would apply some of these micro mini findings from the bottom up of the brain to let's go to tribalism, because I think we got a fair amount of tribalism going on right now in the US, as you probably I feel like the U.S. is a giant reality show right now, and I say that as a U.S. citizen. We live in a reality show. It's quite.
It's not only the United States,
right?
It's Canada, in England, Germany.
That's true. You guys are
Australia.
starring too. You're starring in that. Yeah, no, I do. I do love reading the BBC and CBC, right? Canadian Broadcasting.
CBC is Canadian, yes.
And so I have a lot of friends in Toronto. Being from Michigan, they said Detroit's not our jam. We're going to Toronto, so they're expats over there. But I would love to just get into what is going on with this sort of tribal situation, and how do you see it?
Okay, so tribalism. The word tribal is triggering for some people now, I have to say.
Oh, well, yes, absolutely.
It sounds as though one's being derogatory about indigenous culture or something
right.
like that. And by the way, that perspective is very tribal. Tribalism is at a far, far, far deeper level. I've uploaded a video called Consciousness Explained that describes how consciousness, or the building blocks of consciousness, started to evolve like 500 and 600 million years ago. Like it's a Precambrian era when animals started to swim in open water. So it's So that was the point where nervous systems had to sense what was happening in the environment and move accordingly. So if a little worm was encountering a speck of something, it had to know where that speck was, and it had to make a very quick judgment, so to speak, judgment not being an appropriate word in this case, but decisions as to whether that thing was edible or a threat. And the ways the nervous system did that haven't changed. And if you look at the human brain, one of the incredible insights that geneticists and paleobiologists have figured out in the last 20 and 30 years is this thing called deep homology. The ways our brains work are extraordinarily simple. So scientists, broadly speaking, through history, have imagined that the human brain is massively different, let's say, from other mammalian brains and bird brains and reptilian brains. But when you understand what's happening at a genetic and a cellular level, those differences vaporize. So my whole thing is, when you understand what's happening with the human brain from moment to moment, we are always making a judgment as to whether we should be reacting positively to something or reacting negatively. So if there's a projectile coming towards your head, you don't have to think about whether you should be moving out of the way. You instantly move out of the way. And if you see some food that looks nice and you're hungry, you're immediately attracted to that. So when I use the word tribalism and this instant fluid, the way our brain is responding to the world, I'm actually using it in terms of sort of the deep neuronal mechanisms that are operating all the time, and I believe it's once you start to look at how important we are as social animals, like how it's so important how we react to each other and figure out who's on our side or who's not. You can see that we're doing the same thing all the time with the people around us. Now, it's not like I sort of look at you and say, "Oh, you're part of my tribe." It happens in a very dynamic manner. So, if we happen to be on the same football team, we're in the same tribe, and we'll sort of like each other, and we'll pat each other on the back, and so on. If we happen to be in an opposing team, we'll react differently to each other. And the human brain has this remarkable capacity to change allegiances in a second. And I would say that pretty much every word we utter, and this might sound extreme to you, it sounds, I guess, somewhat political, but every single word we hear, and depending on who's speaking it, we're making a judgment as to what it means in terms of our tribal loyalties. In North America, that thinks that vaccines are the answer to the COVID pandemic, and there's another tribe that thinks it's overblown, and you just use that word, and instantly people are making a judgment. Well, is this person part of my tribe or part of the other tribe, the opposing tribe? So that's how I think of tribalism. I think of it as I call it instant and fluid tribalism, and it applies to everything. And honestly, if you're looking at a hotbed for overt and really quite destructive tribalism, you just go to sociology departments, and you'll find all of these different theories about different groups and how evil they are.
Yeah,
how's that for a non-controversial take on the world?
Well, I like it a lot. I mean, I think it's what I like is that you are trying your best to sort of see, I don't know, this is what I'm interpreting, is that you're trying to see things holistically. You're trying to see what is happening over here, what is happening over there, how do these things mix up, how is, tribalism happening? And it's happening instantly. And I think I've been noticing lately, and let me know if you've seen this as well, but that there are even people are wearing markers of their tribe or have like symbols of their tribe that are kind of instantaneously kind of telling you what team you're on. I don't know if you've seen that.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Your tattoos or your earrings or your hairstyle. So a good example of that is a friend of mine who's teaching business in Nebraska, and he recounts how when he's walking down the street and he sees the Virgin Mary in someone's window hanging somewhere, he can instantly tell what tribe the householders belong to.
Yes, and I see that, and I feel like the divisions, especially in the U.S., are becoming more strange and more acute. And so it's like, if you're in, this is just my observation, like if you're in this one team and you believe that vaccines work, that means you also have to believe these 10 other things. And if you're in this team that doesn't believe vaccines work, you're supposed to believe these 10 other things. But I think some people agree with that just fine. But being a person who, myself, I attempt to not, I mean, I'm sure I do because I have emotions and I am persuaded, but attempting not to just sort of like join a team just because this team sounds good to me. I want to look at every issue individually. It can be a bit disconcerting to see that. And I'm sure it's always, I know it's always been that way. I'm just seeing it more now, I think in the last few years, with kind of the proliferation of social media. You can repost your opinion that it might not even be your opinion. You can repost somebody else's opinion immediately, and that goes and ripples across the world. and sort of make these snap judgments sort of without having a conversation with somebody. Not that that's the point of what you were trying to make, but I've just been noticing how that's been working with people. And so, for instance, just any issue you can name, I would love to have a discussion, read about it. And it seems to be the trend, like you said, like, oh, you're either this side or the other side. You pick one. You can't be neutral about this. You can't just be thoughtful about this.
That's right.
You decide quickly.
Yeah, and we don't realize how deep it goes, because the very words we use to describe issues come to us through our news channels and social media, and so you can almost it's almost unavoidable that you gravitate to one source of media or another. You're either reading the New York Times or you're looking at Fox News. It's rare that someone looks at these different outlets and sort of can make judgments as to which has the better story. You tend to gravitate towards the news outlets that most closely approximate your perspectives. But unfortunately, over the last 5 or 10 years, in-depth journalism has largely vaporized just because of the economics of newspapers and just changes in how people buy advertising and what they're looking at. And so consequently, there are fewer and fewer journalists really being thoughtful about subjects. They're just coming up with clickbait themselves, and so that's driving us apart, because we're looking at news outlets that most closely associate with our tribe, whatever that tribe is. So you can't really even help it, which is the really unfortunate thing.
That's true, especially, I mean, I think your average person, just gravitates towards one or the other. And what I mean by average is just, somebody who's out there who's not really thinking about how these things are created. I mean, I used to work for PBS, public broadcasting here in the US. And so I got to see how shows were made and how they were edited. And that always affected my ability to even watch a television show, because I'd say, oh, well, they're off camera doing this or that. They've cut this out. And so then if you go to, most of us haven't studied how journalism is being made. And you being in advertising, you can see how now that people aren't subscribing to papers, most of it's on the internet now. They try to get subscribers that way, but a lot of it's ad driven, that it's actually made the journalism need to crank out more and more articles and get more and more attention and or videos or whatever it is. And the interesting thing is that the stories are too short. So I've noticed two things happening with that, which is a lot of people are confused. A lot of people get addicted to that sort of media. But I also have noticed the rise of the podcast. So, for instance, NPR, National Public Radio here, of course, isn't supposed to be associated with the tribe, but certain people have decided that it might be. They'll have longer shows where they'll take a 20 or 30-minute look at something, right? But that only comes out about once a week. And so if you're looking for media and you're wanting something quickly, it's hard to know where to go. And it's confusing as well, I think, for the person. I was involved in a situation in Michigan a few years ago where we had to pass a government bill to keep our licenses for counselors. And I was helping in the effort organize thousands of counselors to go to the Capitol and do all this stuff and write your senators and write this person and write that. And I went and I was being interviewed by a local news station. It was one of the big three, they called them, CBS, ABC, NBC. I can't remember which one it was. And I remember, telling the whole story and why we want the public involved in all of this. And the guy said to me, he goes, this is a really good interview, but I got to tell you something. I'm only going to use 20 seconds of what you said and not the whole 4 minutes. I said, but that's not going to tell the whole story. that you're not even going to be, people are going to be confused. Like, why would the government ever take away their licenses? They're not even going to understand the context. He goes, and he was like, he kind of took me aside. He's kind of this guy, he's been in, I think he was in his 50s. He's like, well, journalism's changed so much in the last 10 years. He's like, I'm just trying to get through. He's like, I'm just trying to make this piece. He's like, I get it. This cause is a no-brainer. We shouldn't even be here. This is a government glitch, but I'm trying to cover this, and I'm just going to tell the story that you guys need support, but I can't even give the context. I'm like, you can't give the context? He's like, no, they won't let me. I only have this much to tell the story. I've got to say something. I've got to show footage. Then I got a great interview with you, but I'm going to take 20 seconds of what you said. So I remember watching it later that night on the news when I got home, or I actually watched it on the internet because I didn't catch the news because I don't really subscribe to the TV model, but I watched their little clip and I was like, oh my gosh, if I'm the average person, I don't even care about this. Why would I call my senator now? Why would I get involved? I don't know. It's just, it's all scrunched, it's tighter, it's shorter, and
yeah.
And I don't know if that's doing something to our nervous system. That could be a theory of mine. I won't go into that, but
I think it is.
Yeah.
I think it is. But I just want to say that I'm particularly sensitive to the narratives that we see on the media and in the newspapers, because I know how much care and attention brand people like myself and policy wonks and political advisors put into crafting words. And so when I hear a leader or a politician use a phrase, I can generally figure out how much time and effort they've put into that phrase, and it's through the way that you present issues that you can change the way people think about the world. And so, is someone doing what they're doing? Is it a riot or a demonstration? As to which word you use sort of frames it completely differently. And I have to say, and this will expose my true colors a little bit. The whole matter started to really bug me when I started to hear a consensus about climate change, a scientific consensus about climate change, just repeated. And I realized what was happening, because no one was actually talking about the science, which I think is deeply fascinating, important, and we really need to understand it, because we can make far better policy decisions if we understand the complexities. But when it's distilled down to a little scientific talking point that basically cuts off discussion about the details, in my view, it can be adverse for public policy. So I couldn't really care which side you're on. I do care that we are able to talk about it, and that sort of gets into the whole field of therapy, where you I presume, because I don't know really what you do, you suspend judgment. You don't say, well, that's bad. That's a good thought and that's a bad thought. You just don't do that. You say, well, tell me more. What do you mean by that? I would presume, and so it's there are a lot of sort of commonalities between the way I think about the world and I'm sure the way you think about the world.
Yes, as a therapist, the only things we really try to judge are, kind of assessing where the person's at, functionality, risk factors, and dangers if they're in a dangerous addictive state, because that's for their own safety. That's when we break from our model of just listening and doing activities and that sort of thing. But yes, it's interesting when you let somebody really talk about the issues they're upset about or whatever, you often find that it comes down to a simple need not being met in their life, and they're not sure how to get that need met. And so they've, had behaviors that have landed them in mandated therapy, or maybe their partner sent them to therapy for these behaviors or these discussion points. And it's interesting. And the whole point is, if we have a human dialogue that is an actual dialogue, and we're trying to come together, in the therapy room, it leads to healing, because people kind of drop their defenses a little bit, and they learn a new way of thinking without judging what is this, right? That, so we as therapists, we try to stay very neutral as much as possible, except to just, let's hear more about it, and let's find a solution or find the common ground. And eventually a lot of these narratives that, even all the time we hear people coming in upset about the news, and we're saying, okay, well, tell me more about that. And really it comes down to possibly a fear of some sort, or a safety concern, when this giant news story actually has nothing to do with them, right? And so if we can promote real dialogue as humans together, which I'm not exactly sure how to do, because right now there's a lot of quote unquote dialogue going on in Twitter, but it seems like it's like everyone's in their own little silo and they're like zinging each other constantly. It's like we're kind of, you're a hypocrite,
Yeah.
you're a hypocrite. How about we're all hypocrites, and we're all emotional creatures, and how do we have this dialogue, right? Because of the way the media is going and the way communication is going right now on a broader scale. So
somewhere in the book, I mention, and I really believe this, that that the younger generations right now are undergoing some severe stress, and my point is that it's difficult to understand exactly where that anxiety and stress is coming from. It's social media, it's rapid technological change, it's fewer blue collar jobs, it's these different ideas that are reconfiguring what's right and what's wrong in the world, sort of what's acceptable sexually or not, that people are exposed to extreme porn, but at the same time looking at someone for a moment longer is considered aggression, microaggression. So all of these things are making it very difficult for young people to sort of find their direction in life and figure out their journey. And my contention is that some of the sort of the political movements are ways that younger people are expressing those anxieties, but they're not actually the cause of the anxiety. And I get into trouble for this because people are deeply concerned about police violence, Black Lives Matter, the history of slavery, climate change. I mean, these are perceived to be existential, imminent crises that have to be solved. And my point is, actually, I believe they're ways that people are expressing far deeper anxieties. I'm not sure if you go along with me, but even saying that is politically triggering to some people, and that's, I believe, a pity. Let's say.
Yes, I do think I'm going to just throw a little thing in the ring here, because I definitely can see that as a good point about what is the deeper feeling beneath this, right? So, as my African American friends have told me, they said, all this stuff, this is nothing new. This is what we've been dealing with. Been dealing with this our whole lives. So now it's a movement, and that's, for them, they felt good about that. But they also said, why now? Why is this a movement now? And that was their opinion, that this is just the way people have been behaving, and they would like to stop it. But it does, how do you stop it? It comes from education, from dialogue, not necessarily from, maybe this movement will help lead to that. But I do think what I'm seeing also, in my opinion, is the young people have a lot of anxieties because of the internet and the availability of information, that anybody can find information now. We don't know the reliability of all that information, but anyone can have a dialogue with anyone on Reddit. Reddit's a very popular website where people post their opinions and articles and different things and kind of have a little bit of a discussion, is that they're deconstructing all of the systems that were made in the 20th century and even before that. Yeah. And they're deconstructing religion. Maybe I don't know if they're deconstructing science. They're deconstructing a lot of the systems that have made our world the way it is right now. And when you do that, it's scary because you no longer see the world as some sort of reliable thing. You see it as chaos and entropy and
Yes.
coming together. And I think that's actually how the world is. I believe that our narratives about safety and systems and consistency and things politicians say are just to win votes and make people like you. The world is both can be orderly, but usually not. It has its own order. We are part of nature. We're not apart from nature. This whole idea of humans being removed from animals. No, we may be more sophisticated in some ways in our expressions, as far as we know, but we are part of this system, and it's not clean. It's a very messy system, and it's ever changing. So when things are deconstructed, such as the way police have treated people, and going into all these different theories and climate change, it does grip people, what you said, a deeper fear, because this means things aren't fair, right? This means that there's unfairness, and how do I? And then when there's, of course, protests against the protests, then it's like I'm even more angry, right? Because this is unfair and you don't see it. And so I said this before the whole Trump phenomenon. I was at some sort of thing where they were talking about, it was like Hillary versus Trump discussion, and it was, I think, a bunch of Hillary people. And I said, the thing that's troubling me is that not many people here are actually having a dialogue with the other side. We're just pointing at the other side, right? And what would happen if we actually went and talked to them about, I don't know, different things we disagree about. So
I want to bring in a point there that's like a fundamental issue that is, I believe, possibly detrimental, and I believe, as you're saying, that young people and many people are looking for certainty because there is so much uncertainty. And one of the places they look for certainty is science and scientific expertise, and also they're looking to authority and authority figures who can do the right thing for them. And there's been an interesting evolution in the way people view knowledge that goes to the heart of this, I believe. In that when I was at school in England, I was hardly ever given a multiple choice test, and none of my exams were multiple choice. I mean, in mathematics, I was taught that things are either right or wrong, but everything else I was taught was more a matter of observation and one's ability to communicate and to reason. I was never taught that the world is made up of facts that are either right or wrong. And so, we're getting to this whole matter of post-truth. And there's an undercurrent that someone knows the right answer, and I believe that's a mistake, because the right answer, and this is going to sound quite relativistic, but sort of what's right depends on a mutual understanding of what a word means, and so there's a lot of there's a social underpinning to understanding, and more than that, I think historically it hasn't been the case that we've imagined that someone in authority is always necessarily going to have our best interests at heart, and that's why I believe the American Constitution is what it is, because at the heart of it there are checks and balances, because we don't always believe, or we shouldn't always believe, that someone in authority is in the long run going to do the right thing for us, and so there's been this massive change in how we understand what's right and what's incorrect, and I would love there to be more nuance and more appreciation, not in a sort of a postmodernistic, oh, everything's relativistic sort of a way, but understanding comes because of mutually agreed ways of looking at the world, and that is always formed through interpersonal interaction. So that's where we get into the whole political realm, in a historical realm, in a very deep way.
Yes, I think that is a good way to put it, the mutual understanding, because without that, then we just have two what people claim to be truths. And so then it's a popularity contest or something like that, because it doesn't matter what quote unquote facts you present to one side or the other. If you're convinced of one of the sides, the research shows when you try to convince somebody, even with facts and figures about something they believe, they actually usually resist you, or resist you even more. So,
correct.
And I laugh about something you said about history. I was thinking about what's right or what facts are is usually determined by people with clout or power. And so I think that's another breakdown. So how do we get past that? It is mutually agreed meaning, and I think that's a very good point, because post-truth is coming up a lot, and this is what's happening, or this is what's happening, and that's leading to more of what I call it black and white thinking, where it's like either this or that. There's no sort of color spectrum, and we live in a colorful world, and there are lots of different aspects of truth in different areas. I'm not trying to be completely relativistic. There are, things we can determine, but there's a lot of things we don't know.
Of course.
And so how do we, I guess, have the humility to say, I think this is the next right step for me based on what I understand. I don't know. That was just something I thought about.
Yeah, you're dead on. And how this ties back into Consilience is that the mechanistic, scientific, in air quotes, way of thinking about knowledge is that it's sort of digital. It's zeros and ones. It's right or wrong. And words are labels that one attaches to things in the world, and there's no subjectivity in that. It's just the way the world is. Well, once you understand what the brain is actually doing scientifically, and when I say scientifically, I mean scientifically in the non-mythological, mythical way, just in terms of sort of how our eyes work and our ears work, you realize that the brain is doing something completely stunning and invisible to us and remarkable, in that it's taking just hints of what, let's say our eyes are taking hints of what's happening around us. And it's our brain that is creating this full-featured, high-definition, multi-sensory experience that is consciousness. But our brain is actually creating the categories, because the world is an emergent system. It's bottom up, and I would argue everything is, and this is an objective statement, everything is different, because you can't have two particles in the same time that are identical. That's the Pauli exclusion principle. That's a basic sort of principle in physics. So the brain is doing this remarkable thing, and Consilience forces us to acknowledge that that's what the brain is doing, and that you've got to be a lot more open to new ways of looking at the world and describing the world and understanding people. So, and here's what's so mind-bending about Consilience. It is brutally a hardcore science, like, just look at what's happening. But at the same time, once you do that, it opens your mind to recognizing that the practice of science is not much different from the practice of doing many, many other things. It's a human endeavor with all of the attendant pressures. And so that enables one to start sort of talking about things that one had very hard opinions about, and actually saying, well, how did you get to believe that? And I put one example in my book about creationism. 5 years ago, if you told me about creationism, I would say, oh, yeah, well, I believe in evolution, not creationism, because that's, because I'm a science guy. But now my whole position is, well, actually, if you're really scientific about it, and you really understand about evolution, you'll understand that it's a lot more complicated than most people understand. And it's not the metaphor that we should be using for living a life. But more than that, you'll realize that the creationist movement in the United States was started for very good reasons, as a pushback against monism and Volkism, which were part of the cause for the First World War, and then became part of National Socialism and Nazism. So understanding the history of creationism is, I think, something that we should acknowledge, because it's got a lot to teach us. So understand come at it from every angle and understand it, and don't be instantly tribal when you hear a word like evolution or creationism or whatever. Sorry about that rant.
Oh, I like that rant. I think that consilience and understanding the scientific principles, how we understand them now, of how our brain, eyes, ears, sensory systems all work, will hopefully lead us to more openness and more humility as to our position in the world.
There you go. Mm-hmm.
And that being said, the more we can understand that, we're getting rid of some of the old myths we talked about earlier that kind of put humans in this sort of arrogant position as the rulers of the kingdom, or whatever you want to call it. And because that does lead more to this, well, I'm right, you're wrong, your country's bad, our country's good. This black and white, I keep saying, way of looking at things, instead of looking at things from a variety of perspectives. And I think that the more this science is able to, the more this research about how our bodies actually work is promoted, or shown in classrooms and in your book especially, the more people can take us to place of listening. And if you're listening, you are going to understand things. So a very simple thing that was invented thousands of years ago, but John Kabat-Zinn, back in the 1980s, he invented, mindfulness-based stress reduction program to help people with stress. Mm-hmm. And he studied it and studied it and studied it. And all you really did was sit and breathe and pay attention to your breathing and maybe listen to some bells or whatever. And you just stop thinking so much. This active thinking was gone, and you're sort of passive listening. Yeah. And just from that has spawned so many different types of therapies, just from listening to not only your own breathing, but when you do that, it slows down your mind enough to actually sometimes uncover reasons and meanings and troubles that you've been suppressing. And so just like that, I think in our world, if we're trying to solve something or move on together, we have to be listening to what other people are saying. And then why are they saying that? What's the context? And where did they get that context? And why do I believe what I believe? And questioning that brings us hopefully to a place of dialogue and not just two-way monologue, which is what I believe most of social media and the news is two-way monologue and character defamation. And I mean, I won't put out my hat in the ring. I mean, there's certain people I think that should deserve to lose our respect based on their actions. However, they're still a person, and we need to understand everything about them, and what they did and why they did and what stance they took, because that can lead us to understand ourselves. Which I think it does start with us. It does start with the human, the person, because we created these systems to begin with.
Well, whenever I hear a crazy opinion that I don't quite understand, I always start by saying, I wonder what journey that person went through to to form that opinion. So I'm interested how they got there, their personal journey, and I actually do the same when I'm dealing with a company CEO and they say they want to do this or that. They want to double sales. I'm thinking, oh, okay, what are they at? Where have they come from, and why do they want to do that? It's not because they're interested in just doubling sales. There's a reason for it, but I also say to myself, if someone's being particularly odious, if I don't run the other way, I think, how would I react if this person was my son or my daughter? Not that I have a son. I would probably not regard what they're saying as being the most important thing about them. I would just regard it as a foible or a quirk. And you would just be forgiving and treat it with some degree of humor. And I think sometimes that's what we need to do, rather than it trigger our tribalism and that instinct that we have to rally together with our other tribal mates and attack this other tribe. Just acknowledge that you're both human and you both have had potentially, very difficult journeys, and that's what you're all about. I understand. It's about understanding the difficulties that people have encountered through their lives and giving them some sympathy. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. Giving them some sympathy and hoping that they can find a way to get out of this pattern they're in, that they want to get out of, so they can feel. And honestly, the oddly thing about, I'll say this, the odd thing about psychological patterns is they're often either constricting and sort of rigid, or they're chaotic. And both of those, if you go to either extreme, are not good for the psyche, or not good for relationships. So what in psychology, what we're trying to do is help people find the middle. It's a made up middle. I'm just making this up. It's not that everyone has to be sort of a pacifist in the middle. It's that they find a place psychologically where they can see the chaos over here and they can see the rigidness in their behavior over here, and sort of also with different people in their lives, they can see this aspect here and this aspect here, and sort of figure out how they can navigate the world instead of an automatic pattern of complete rigidity or complete chaos or reactionary feelings towards stimuli or different people or jobs. Yeah. So I think
I'm just going to explain to your podcast listeners that you've been illustrating this whole point very well with your hands and arms, and so that aspect of the explanation is going to be lost on your audience.
That's correct. Yes,
we're using Zoom, so I appreciate what you've been showing me.
Yes, I like to use my hands. So I have this will be at a podcast, but you can imagine me with my hands up on one side or the other. But yeah, that's what it's about, and I'm just really excited that I got to interview you, and I'm still reading the book, and I'm going to finish it. But it's just, I'm loving it because it falls in line with how I would just love people to know this. There's a huge part of psychotherapy that's actually, we call it psychoeducation, where we're teaching them some of the stuff from your book about how the nervous system works in a very elementary way, so that they can understand their reactions to things without taking this old world. Well, I'm a shameful person. I'm guilty. I'm a less than person because this happened or whatever. That is a huge piece of freedom. It's just the education, and then the techniques, and then the specifics.
Yeah.
And also the thing about humans coming together and having a dialogue. I always, it's just sometimes I just laugh and I think it would be great if everyone could just pause for a minute and remember that we live on a planet, a blue planet, and it's really the only inhabitable one, I believe, within range.
Yeah, if we screw it up, that's it.
That's it. So I mean, we're here together, and we don't agree, but how do we coexist? So anyway, it's just something to think about once in a while.
Can I just finish with this?
Go for it.
I guess request. I'd love it if you finish reading my book. It sounds as though you will. it's. I have to say, it's not an easy book because it touches on so many different subjects, and not everyone's interested in science and history and sociology and all of the different things. But across many ideas that really jive with your opinions, but also some that you might have a problem with, and I'm actually somewhat critical of psychiatry and nutrition science and economics and like disciplines that I term that have become pointified. I use that term, pointified, and you'll learn about that. But I'd really appreciate the opportunity to circle back with you and hear your opinions from the standpoint of someone who's been dealing with people and the challenges of living one's life, because I think my experience in the world and your experience of the world are so completely different, and I just love the opportunity to find out where I've got it right or where I've frankly I need to do some more thinking, and vice versa. Maybe there's some ideas that you've had that you might want to rethink, and so I'd really welcome the opportunity for us to circle back, and I, if your listeners are interested.
I'd love that. I've had a few people repeat guests on the show, and so what I think I would love to do is take you up on that. And what I think, I mean, if we could record it if we want and put it out. We don't have to, but what I think that would be good is because in your book I was really jiving with this scientific report part of it, but then you start taking those scientific findings and getting into tribalism and all these other points that you make, and I will take notes actually on those points.
Good.
And bring it back to you. So I will definitely. I think the listeners would love to have Tom Beakbane Part 2, where we discuss some of these points and maybe some things we disagree on, because I think that would be an interesting conversation for sure. I'd love it.
Great, Paul. Well, this has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. It's been my pleasure, and I'm just going to encourage my audience loves books, and so I'm going to encourage them. I'm going to put the book link in the show notes, including the Audible link, because everyone, if you're commuting or whatever, now that the world is starting to slightly open up here, it's a good way to consume information auditorily. So.
Could I just say that? Yeah. So the book's available on Amazon. It's available as an ebook, a paperback, a hardback, and the audiobook is particularly good. It's available on Google Play and Audible and so on. It's narrated by a British actor called Philip Batley, and I think he did a superb job narrating it. So I'd love to engage with anyone in your audience who reads it and has an opinion.
That's great, and and I will put any links to websites that you want me to put in there as well. So we can do that, and you might get some engagement that way. So, all right, thank you, Tom.
Paul.
Confused and ecstatic. And there you have it. This has been another episode of the Intentional Clinician Podcast. I want to apologize for about the last 20 or 30 minutes of that podcast. My microphone apparently got disconnected due to some technology issues, and so that was sort of a cheaper microphone recording without my knowledge the rest of the podcast. Rest assured, next time I have Tom Beakbane on the podcast, we will be using the excellent microphone that I purchased for the duration of the show. Honestly, if you're curious, I really think you should check out Tom Beakbane's book, Consilience. I have been listening to it as an audiobook, and it contains so many interesting observations because a lot of the things he's writing about I had read in some neuroscience books in the neurobiology series, but I hadn't really heard them applied in the ways that he was bringing them across genres and across different types of subjects. So it's really, really an interesting book, and I think you're going to love it. And I'm hoping to have Tom back on the podcast later this year. So his link and the book's link will all be in the show notes. If you are looking for an EMDRIA consultant, I am now an EMDRIA consultant in training, and I can provide 15 of the 20 hours needed to become EMDRIA certified. I am hosting 2 EMDRIA consultation groups at this time. Right now, they are mostly online. You can check out details in the show notes or go to counselingsupervisorgr.com. If you are in need of counseling, don't hesitate to make an appointment with a local counselor in your area. You can also make an appointment with the excellent clinicians in the Grand Rapids area at Health for Life Grand Rapids and the Trauma Informed Counseling Center of Grand Rapids by visiting www.healthforlifegr.com. And if you are in the state of Michigan, they can also help you online. The recording you just listened to consists of the personal opinions of Paul Krauss, and while these are based upon the literature he has read and his experience in the field, as well as his guest's experience and literature the guest has read, these opinions should not be viewed as a definitive opinion or fact on this or any other subjects. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for treatment. If you are in a crisis, please call 911 or the National Suicide Prevention Line at 1-800-273-8255. Are you a young person of color feeling down, stressed out, or overwhelmed? Text Steve, that's STEVE, to 741-741, and a live, trained crisis counselor will respond. As I said earlier, I've released my first online course for parenting adult children, or what is called for the parents of young adults. It all applies. It's almost 3 hours of video content, and it's on sale on udemy.com right now. Check it out. You can even see a preview. The link will be in the show notes. And if you're a therapist looking to bring EMDR into their practice, look no further than EMDR Training Solutions. They are fantastic trainers. Honestly, I can't say enough good things about them. I've known some of these trainers and creators of the content for over 10 years, and they are reputable people that have finally come together and made their own EMDR training class, and it is awesome. And right now, if you use the word intentional as the code at checkout, you will receive $100 off your EMDR training. Are you a busy professional that is shopping for books online? Did you know that if you use www.bookshop.org, you can order online from the comfort of your home or office while supporting a local brick-and-mortar business near you? Check out details at bookshop.org. If you are a therapist or a counselor or a social worker and you have not joined your local organization, please do so. The Michigan Mental Health Counselors Association, for instance, if you live in Michigan, is working to increase the availability of quality mental health services statewide, increasing education, promoting best practices, and working to keep licensed professional counselors and other professionals accessible by the public. I am also a member of the Arizona Counselors Association, the American Mental Health Counselors Association, and the American Counseling Association. I know I'm a member of a lot of them, but listen, they are the way that you are going to keep your job for the future and make sure that we can start integrating mental health into different programs such as education and community centers. So if you're not a member, please join. Until next time on the Intentional Clinician Podcast, I'm wishing you all a safe and peaceful week.
Falling into the sea.